Welcome to Constructive Thinking, a podcast from the Progressive Contractors Association. I'm Paul DeYoung, the CEO and President of the Progressive Contractors Association of Canada, and today I will be talking with Ian Anderson, a veteran of Canada's oil and gas sector. Today's podcast was recorded on May 29, 2026. Welcome, Ian.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Glad to be here.
Well, why don't we begin with an introduction? You've got a long history in this marketplace, at least relatively recently on the Trans Mountain project, which we will talk about in a minute. But why don't you give our listeners a bit of a thumbnail sketch of who you are and where you've been?
Sure. Very quickly, I started my career in Winnipeg back in the 70s, working for the gas utility there. I went through numerous ownership changes from Northern and Central Gas, which was an old Conrad Black company, to ICG, to West Coast Energy, who rebranded as Centra Gas, if you recall. I then moved out to Vancouver Island in about 1999 with West Coast Energy when we sold the gas utility in Manitoba to Manitoba Hydro. And then I started a path to Calgary. I spent 2 or 3 years in Victoria with the gas utility there, a couple of years in Vancouver with working for John Reed under what became Terrason. And then John moved me to Calgary to work in the pipeline section he had in Calgary, which, was the Trans Mountain pipeline, but as well the corridor pipeline and the express pipeline, which Terrason owned at the time. So I spent a couple of years under Terrason ownership here in Calgary in the early 2000s. And then Kinder came along in 2005, Kinder Morgan that is, and bought Terrason. And that's when I was promoted to president and CEO of Terrason Pipelines, which became really Trans Mountain and Kinder Morgan. And that would have been in about 2005. And then the journey since 2005 has been the expansion of Trans Mountain, really. We divested of Corridor to IPO. We divested of Express to Enbridge, kept the Trans Mountain asset and worked on its expansion, which we're going to talk about. So that's the thumbnail, Paul.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, Trans Mountain is a topic I'd like to talk about. It was a project of tremendous national significance, a project that I think benefits all of Canada. It is the first, not the first, but it, there was the legacy pipeline that was built, I think, in the 50s. Mm-hmm. But it was roughly speaking doubled or twinned. And I think one of the interesting things that you could start on, maybe, Ian, many people wouldn't know that when you want to build a pipeline, even on an existing right-of-way, what they call a brownfield patch of land, it takes a lot of time. A lot of moving parts. It's not a question of 2 or 3 or 4 years. It's usually 10 or more years. So talk a bit about that journey. You're working for Terrason. Kinder Morgan picks it up. It begins to kind of materialize that this pipeline is going to go forward or should go forward. What does that look like for you, for the project? And what were the barriers that needed to be overcome to get to yes on that pipeline?
Yeah, Paul, that's all correct. And we really started the expansion of Trans Mountain in 2006, 7, right around the time Kinder acquired Trans Mountain. If you recall, we did the Anchor Loop, which was really the first phase of the expansion. We went through Jasper National Park and twinned the pipe through the park and built some pump stations and really did our phase 1 of the expansion. And then in 2009-10, we turned our mind to a fuller expansion of Trans Mountain. And we spent, I would say, 2.5 to 3 years commercially talking to producers about production, about supply, about egress destinations they were looking for, about the Gulf Coast versus the West Coast. If you like, that was the time that Keystone got developed because they paid their attention to the Gulf Coast as being a desirable market. So we spent 2 or 3 years commercially with the shippers and producers and refiners in North America and abroad. That was our first venture into Chinese interests as well. It developed the project to the point where we had a commercially viable project by about 2010 and 11. And then we turned our minds to the rest of the regulatory process, which is the engineering, the design, the scope, the environmental work, the indigenous work. And the original in-service date was scheduled to be 2017. Well, we completed it in 2024. So it took about 7 years longer than originally planned, and of course cost tens of billions of dollars more than we had originally expected, and that we had contracted for with our shippers. So it was a long journey. I don't think Canada had built a project like that in decades. As you would know, the labor requirements, the workforce requirements, Site C and CGL were happening at the same time. So it was a competition for labor and resources, and we worked with you and your organization extensively to try and find the right fit for the components of labor we needed. We went through numerous regulatory process in 12 court cases. We lost our CPCN, our certificate to build, in 2017. Got that back about 6 or 8 months later. But the one learning, if I look back on it, Paul, that is maybe most significant is that when we started that journey in 2009 or 10, say, none of us were really talking about Indigenous reconciliation or climate change or carbon taxes or green policy or local interest to any large degree. Pipelines were out of sight, out of mind. And we went through even social media didn't exist when we started to any large extent. So we went through a phase of development that society at the same time was developing it's some of its values and some of its moral judgments. And we got caught up in a web of very, very complex societal and political matters that we had to navigate through. I mean, I can't count the number of premiers that I worked through, the number of prime ministers, God knows how many mayors and chiefs, like dozens and dozens of changes of administration at varying levels. So we had to navigate that. We had to also navigate this rising voice of local interest, whether that's Indigenous or non-Indigenous. How you built in today's society through communities and disrupted roads and parks and pathways, all in the spirit of progress and industrial development, became really a calling card that we had to respond to, and ultimately, I believe we did. We listened to people, we listened to opinions and concerns and issues, and ultimately we're successful. But those are some of the macro, I think, learnings that I took from that period of time, Paul.
Well, it certainly underscores what I think is kind of the amplified complexity of a pipeline. Many of the listeners will be from the construction sector and are familiar with building structures on a piece of land. And so there are some familiar themes about community engagement and, some requirements baked into the commercial terms to ensure environmental fitness and some of these things. But a pipeline is like that on steroids. I mean, you've got a cross-country pipeline, by definition, is going from point A to point B. It might be 10 kilometers, it might be 1,000 kilometers. And by definition, you're going through different communities. You're engaging with those individuals along the way, along the right-of-way. There's Indigenous groups, particularly in British Columbia, where you have both ceded and unceded territory to navigate. Environmental concerns, which are quite significant, not just because of the elevated conversation, but because of the disturbance of land that's not centralized in one physical spot. You're disturbing the land sequentially over and over again for dozens, if not hundreds, or even thousands of kilometers. It's very, very complicated. Just as a quick, just to indulge me, and I think our listeners might be fascinated, just on the environmental performance of a pipeline. I think a lot of Canadians think that pipelines are these horrible, disruptive things that are dangerous to build, dangerous to operate. I know from my own experience in working with our members that pipelines are built in a very deliberate and safe manner, even to the point, which sometimes feels a little bit over the top, of removing, local flora and fauna to build the pipeline and then putting them back in place, restoring dry creek beds and moving, indigenous species of frogs and birds. Talk for a moment. Just, I think it's kind of fun for our listeners to hear, Ian, how complicated it is just on that particular score to build a pipeline.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. And I'm glad you brought it up because it was something to observe. At one point, we had more biologists working on this project than there were in the rest of Canada. We were moving snake pits and forest snails and salamanders. You're right on the fauna and flora and the movement of native grasses and plants, even to the point where when you remove the soil to build the ditch to put the pipe in it, you had to be careful to put the soil back in the same sequence that you took it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that the integrity of the soil and the subsoils were all maintained. The number of river crossings that we intended to directionally drill so that we're not disturbing the surface of the creek bed or riverbed started out to be, kind of a dozen, and we ended up doing about 5 times that. Again, coming from the input of communities, particularly Indigenous communities, around the sensitivity to those streams and those crossings. We ended up about, I don't know, a quarter, a fifth of the pipe being heavy walled pipe that we had to bring in from Asia. We put heavier walled pipe in all locations that were very urban dense, road crossings, railway crossings, river crossings. We changed modes of construction regularly to accommodate local interests. We had the experience of being shut down for a number of weeks because of a hummingbird nest that an aggressive monitor from Environment Canada found and shut us down. We got shut down for disturbing 2 robins' nests. And fair enough, one of the contractors had cut some of the bushes a little bit too closely to an area that was cordoned off and disturbed a couple of robins' nests, and we were shut down for I think about 5 weeks for clearing in that area, and we learned from that, but it doesn't speak to the 25,000 robins' nests we also protected. Yes. And avoided. So the environmental learnings and requirements, if you went on site to some of these construction locations, you would have more monitors than you would have workers. We had Indigenous monitors, we had environmental safety. And so the execution of a pipeline project like this back to where you started was very, very deliberate and cautious and carefully done. If you think of the original Trans Mountain, there hasn't been a major incident in that pipeline in 60 years. And the construction of this new pipeline started up, and there hasn't been one iota of issue or release from the pipe. We installed state-of-the-art Alberta developed hi-fi technology to leak detection. So it's I'm proud to say, and I would challenge anybody to disprove this pipe being really one of the safest and most well-built pipes by your contractors and others that we can have.
Well, that's well said, and I think it underscores something that needs to be told more often and better, which is that there's a tremendous amount of stewardship that goes into building a pipeline. And everybody from the project owner to the contractors and the workers understand this. It's not easy to do it, but there's a strong commitment, and I think a lot of Canadians need to know that strong commitment is there to preserve the integrity of the land, and often, at the risk of maybe overstating it, leave the land better than it was, because a lot of science goes into it, a lot of deliberation, a lot of intention. So kudos to you guys for doing that so well.
There was just to pick up on that really quickly, Paul. There's a location up on the bluff, just south of Kamloops, a provincial park, Lac du Bois, and we're building a pipe there, and you come off of that bluff, and you come straight down this big cliff right beside the airport, then across the North Thompson River to our site, which is south of that. But as we were designing the route up on that bluff through that park, we discovered a whole corridor of non-native grasses that were put there by TELUS when they ran fiber up there years and years ago. And we made the commitment to the province and in the municipality of Kamloops that we would take out those non-native grasses that TELUS had put in and replace them with native grasses. So there was an example of where we left things better than we thought.
Yeah, that's good. Another element, and as you mentioned earlier, there's so many elements that too much for us to go through properly, but I think a very significant one that is still relevant to this day, given current talks around another West Coast pipeline, which we'll get to later, is engagement as you related to like communities along the right of way, but also Indigenous communities. And without trying to embarrass you, Ian, one of the things that always struck me as I got to know you through that time was your capability in very calmly but deliberately meeting with Indigenous groups, plurally, probably not just one, but many, across the right of way, and having the meaningful discussions that lowered the temperature and recognized the interests that they had in terms of, again, the environment, but also the communities that were being impacted. Talk a bit about how you navigated the engagement with Indigenous peoples across that, what was it, 1,200 kilometers-ish? 1,000?
Yeah, about 1,100 kilometers.
Yeah.
And it's something we learned early on, Paul, that as I like to say, I knew how to do business in BC, Alberta, Merritt, Kamloops, Edson, Burnaby, but we had no idea how to do business within these Indigenous communities. And so we sought out to take a journey to learn about the communities. What are their interests? What are their fears? What are their desires? What are their capabilities? What are their aspirations? What does the makeup of their community look like? What are some of their social needs? And we got to know, and I got to know the communities first as a person who was interested in doing business within their territory. And that in and of itself lowered the temperature because I wasn't there, with a project in hand, waving it in front of them and saying, I need your support to build this pipe. I'll give you jobs. Don't worry. It was a white sheet of paper approach where we learned about the people. And I can remember a great friend of mine who passed a few years ago, Chief Clem Seymour at Seabird Island, which is a community just near Hope when you come out of the Coquihalla into the Fraser Valley. And he was a very, very inspirational leader to his people and to me. And one of the things he said to me right at the beginning that I took to heart was, he said, Ian, before you build anything on our land, we need to walk the land together. We need to, you and I, spend time on the land, walking, to see what it is we're protecting, to see what it is that's important to my people, and understand what the effects are going to be of you building here. And it was a beautiful relationship, but it taught me that I had to put myself in their place and understand better their history, their values, what was important to them, how they got to be where they are. I didn't get into the politics and the legal rights and title cases. I just believed and accepted whatever they told me, and we went from there. So it was a longer process, but we took the time. And at the end of the day, Paul, we had the support of every single nation from Edmonton to the west coast of Vancouver Island, save for the Tsleil-Waututh on Burnaby Inlet, and their issues were different than just the pipe. So it was a journey, and it was a journey of really caring and learning. And I think if industry has anything to take from the Trans Mountain experience. It is not. It is. We can't judge. We can't see this as obligations. We need to see it as a learning and an opportunity.
That's well said. A couple of responses on my part. The first one, I think that's very important to emphasize, not putting words in your mouth, but in my world of kind of labor relations, there's always a kind of a tension between being positionally based or interest based. And our position is that interest based collective bargaining is a much more appropriate approach, because you first look at, forget about, saying, we want this and you want that, and you begin to kind of like fight each other. You first say, well, these are our interests. What are your interests? You begin to try to find out where you're coming from. And I think that's a much more sophisticated and appropriate way that you undertook, which was to first hear people and listen. And eventually some positions will emerge, but that early work to do that interest-based connection is so important. The other one, when you talked about it was a slow process. It reminds me years ago when I was traveling to visit a pipeline up near Fort St. John, the middle of winter, icy roads, terrible conditions on these backcountry gravel roads. And at one point we stopped and weren't exactly sure where to go. So somebody came and pulled over and talked to us. And we said, well, how long does it take to get to Pink Mountain from here? And he goes, well, it'll take you about 6 hours if you go fast and about 3 hours if you go slow. And his thing was, if you go fast, you're going to hit the ditch. You're going to wipe out. These are treacherous roads. So just take your time. And again, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but it strikes me that taking the time to do what you did was probably more efficient than if you had tried to bulldoze your way through and go fast, which would have taken longer.
Without a doubt. And, what it did is you talk about, no matter what the style of negotiation is, you're always going to run into differences and debates. And having the relationships established first enabled those debates to happen in a wholesome, productive way, because you respected each other. You didn't just walk out of the room never to talk again. You walked out and you came back and you reflected and you tried to find compromise. So it just sets up for a much healthier conversation and ultimately, what can be negotiations into what's right. But taking the time up front definitely helped us.
Well, before we move on to the next topic, I think another comment I'll make on that is it has become quite fascinating in the construction industry. This is not always the case, that a more effective way to engage between contractor and client, between union and contractor, stakeholders in that sort of that ecosystem, is to do that early engagement, to have those calm discussions, and to collaborate as much as you can, even though sometimes collaboration seems a little bit kind of loose and kind of imprecise. It's very important to do that, because if you don't, you run into a lot of problems which end up either being transactional or purely adversarial. And usually those are not only a time burden to get into those arguments, but they also cost more money, because different parties will begin to retreat into their posture, into their position, and will begin to put prices on the risk that they're bearing because they're being forced into a corner. So I give kudos to you, because I suspect that what you did with the Indigenous people is the same thing you did with the communities and the same thing you did with the unions on the project and the contractors, which was to have as many collaborative type conversations as possible.
Yeah, 100%. And that culture wove through the whole organization, and I really demanded that to be the high road approach we took to business, and that where we encountered a conflict, a dispute, a disagreement, we did it in a very principled, high road, understanding way. I always maintained that whatever decisions we made, whether it was with a contractor, with a community, with an Indigenous nation, we always had to be able to answer to ourselves and our employees and our owner and the public, for that matter, why we were making that decision. And I kept on coming back to why. And if I couldn't answer why, to direction I was giving to a junior project manager to contract with this community or this contractor with this band relationship. If I couldn't answer why, then I would pause and reflect, because the why tests your leadership stamina and cohesiveness, and I think that went, whether it was, as you say, a contractor conversation. And you and I had many difficult conversations as we moved through that.
Yep.
But we landed in good places, and we understood, why we were making those decisions.
Totally. Well, let's bridge. We're talking pipelines, but and pipelines is definitely on the Canadian mind these days. We used to kind of shy away from them. I think the Trans Mountain Coastal GasLink project kind of undeniably put that back into the frame. But now we have a different circumstance. We have a challenge with how the Americans are structuring the tariff situation, and our Prime Minister has, I think, correctly determined that Canada has a job to do to build our nation and to fortify ourselves economically, occupationally, et cetera. And so I think most people would know that the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta have worked very hard to put together a memorandum of agreement to get a West Coast pipeline built. That is, as we already discussed, easier said than done. In this particular case, there are now political considerations because it's a grand bargain. It's not just a pipeline. There's a Pathways Alliance component. There is a carbon tax component. So they have bitten off a lot to chew on. And I'm not going to necessarily ask you to talk about all those things. But what is it going to take, Ian, given your experience and your lessons learned, your best practices taken in hand, to get that West Coast pipeline built? What are some observations you can give?
Yeah, sure. It is a grand bargain. It is a bold step. It is a profoundly progressive, I think, step for Alberta and Canada to be taken this time. I agree with everything you said about the Prime Minister, and I spent a good bit of time with Minister Hodgson as well, and believe he's doing everything he can to move this forward. The NPO is, I believe, and can continue to play a key role in driving the regulatory efficiency that I didn't have. I was in a regulatory quagmire for a better part of a decade. And I think that the NPO, with their experience and the people that got there, who, as you would know, I know quite well, have the mission to find a way to make regulatory decisions and processes more efficient, less duplicate, ultimately better for all, because you're coming to solutions faster and investors are more satisfied, and communities are getting what they rightfully want and need faster. As far as the MOU and the West Coast Pipe project themselves, I think there are very bold, aggressive steps being taken to advance that project. As I said at the beginning, the Trans Mountain expansion, I worked 3 years commercially with producers and shippers to get to an agreement, and that work has to be done for this pipeline too.
Yeah.
We've had lots of politicians, whether it's the Premier, the Prime Minister, or others, saying great things about the prospect of getting a pipe built, but you don't get a pipe built until you've got commercial agreements, until you've got Indigenous, participation, be that investment or support in some fashion. And you don't build it until you've done your groundwork, environmentally, design, scope, route, terminal location, marine response capabilities, like we built in the South Coast around Trans Mountain. We've got to duplicate in the North Coast if we end up in and around Rupert. So there's lots to be done. I think that their eyes are open to the work that has to be done to get from here to there. I know, Alberta is thinking about that process and what the steps need to be. We're nowhere near the point of saying we've ticked all the boxes and we're ready to start construction, but we certainly have I believe, the people focused on doing the work, which is the quiet work. I mean, as I spoke to many senior politicians, earlier this year, all of the political will is wonderful, and it creates alignment, and it's an alignment that I never had, federally, provincially aligned around the objective. And if we've got that alignment, that's wonderful, and that's going to create a lot of momentum and efficiency and clarity and transparency for investors. But we still have to do the work on the ground. We still have to do the Indigenous work. We still have to do the environmental work, the community work, and let's start turning our minds to that work very, very quickly. And I think that's the next step. It is tied to pathways. It is tied to carbon pricing. I think we're going to find out more around what the path forward on pathways is going to be and what its relationship to this pipe is. I know that, they're being pursued somewhat independently, knowing that in the MOU, they're kind of hinged together. And what that hinge looks like, I suppose, is something that has to be determined. But there's no shortage of ambition and commitment, federally and provincially, to getting this done. There's no shortage of alignment, I believe. And now it's doing the work that otherwise, in a traditional sense, might have taken 5 or 6 years, and doing it in 2. And the challenge to us is to do that. And I've spoken to industry extensively about this as well, Paul, and your members would I hope appreciate hearing it. Additionally, is that we've stood back for the last decade and pointed our finger at administrations and governments and regulators and authorities that have gotten in the way of the industrial development necessary to move our oil and gas to global markets. And now we're in a phase where those parties have heard. They've seen the imperative that you cite, given our U.S. relations and trade relations, and need to develop resources that the world is there to acquire. And so they're doing their work to change regulatory process, to create more efficient and streamlined, aligned paths. We as industry need to respond to that too. Our engineering paradigm would have us design a pipe for 2 or 3 years. Well, now we're saying to ourselves, we got to design it in 8 months. So we know what the conditions are to get it done, but the strain comes back to industry now, I believe, to get its house in order, to be able to execute on and take advantage of, I think, some of the timelines and investment transparency that we're getting from the Prime Minister. So we can't be pointing fingers anymore. We need to self-reflect and do our work.
Well said. Well, we could go on for quite a long time about this because there's so many aspects, but I think that's probably enough on the MPO and the Pacific Tidewater pipeline. We will see, not just you and I, but all of us will see how that transpires.
Yeah.
Before we wind this down, I want to pivot to something else, which is a more recent initiative that you're involved in the nuclear sector. I think it's incumbent on the construction sector and on Canada to look at a more adult conversation about oil and gas that recognizes the stewardship and the performance that the stakeholders can provide and do provide to make it a safer and more effective industry. But it's not the only way to generate the energy that we need in our country. Of course, we have hydro. We have solar and wind, but there is also a legacy industry that many people either don't know about, or if they do know about it, they are afraid of it, which is nuclear. You are working with a group called Energy Alberta. Can you talk a little bit about that initiative? I think that's a very interesting body of work.
Love to, and it's very interesting. It's interesting for me coming from the pipeline space because it is different. It is a single footprint. It's not the long linear type of infrastructure that you talked earlier about. And if we not without looking at numbers and studies in detail, we know that powering our economy into the future is going to require more and more generation, whether it's AI driven or vehicle driven or other uses. And we also know we want to be moving broadly decade after decade to a cleaner, less fossil fuel consuming generation grid. So I think, there's been a large nuclear hub in Ontario that's existed for decades now using Canadian technology that's been very successful without incident. It's world class and world leading. And it's time for us in the West to look at nuclear development, I believe, to provide that stable base load power that our society is gonna need. So we've started this project. It really started back in about 15 years ago. The same group, Wayne and Scott Hennessy, private entrepreneurs in our city, did work on this project decades ago. The timing wasn't right for it. They ended up selling their interest to Bruce Power, and nothing was done with it. We've got an MOU, a renewed MOU in relationship with Bruce Power. We've also got relationship with the two nuclear power providers, both the Atkins Realis for the CANDU Canadian technology, as well as Westinghouse, which is owned by Campbell and Brookfield Canadian corporations. So we're studying, putting in place a utility scale, not an SMR size. This is a 4,800 megawatt large nuclear facility up in the Peace River region. We've been working now for about eight months now on our Indigenous outreach. And you're right, people are fearful. They've got visions of nuclear.
All right.
So we're doing a lot of education, a lot of field work with Indigenous communities up in that region to both see what the opportunities can be, but also understand what the kind of safety conditions of a nuclear facility are and how they look and how they're built. So I think it's very exciting. I mean, it's a long runway. It's probably a better part of a decade before first power, but we're starting to talk to power needs. And looking at power purchase agreements, we even had lots of conversation, obviously, with Alberta and the federal government, and even BC. And this goes back to the MOU, which speaks about power interties between our provinces.
Yep.
So we're looking to tie this facility into the Site C facility in northern BC to provide for that additional sustainable power that BC needs out to the coast for its LNG facility. So we think the time is right, the fit is right. We believe that the national interest is served by really taking a serious look at nuclear power here in Alberta. And I'm excited about it. And it's new, it's different for Alberta and for Albertans, but we're, Scott and Wayne are spending private capital to get this thing going, and we'll be looking for some, government support along the way. But it's a real exciting project to be a part of.
Well, if you need a few good contractors to help you build it, I'm smiling here off camera, but we're happy to do that. I think the skill sets. I'm gonna genericize this of the Alberta contractor community. Have been deeply steeped in building these large petrochemical and oil sands facilities, and I suspect that those skill sets translate well onto a large nuclear type of project. So, listen, Ian, I'm gonna end it here because we could go on for hours, but I think this is good. You've given us a great overview of your time. Well, prior to, but during the Trans Mountain Pipeline, we've talked about the prospects of a new Pacific tidewater pipeline being built and the challenges thereof, and of the promise of new, I wouldn't say new, but nuclear being something that is being dusted off as an opportunity to generate those energy molecules that our country so greatly needs. So, Ian, thank you for giving us your time. I wish you well, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Paul, and I wish all of your contractors and stakeholders well. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent or the program host.